This is a CitrusTV News Special Report.
Nearly a year in the making, former Attorney General Loretta Lynch's review of the Department of Public Safety is complete. I'm Ricky Sayer.
And I'm Carmella Boykin. We're breaking in with this long list of the long-anticipated report that came around 2 p.m. today. This independent investigation comes after demands from #NotAgainSU to look into the actions of DPS and the response to the protests last year.
The university has experienced 30 bias-related incidents since November 7, 2019. The majority of those hate crimes took place over a 3-week span in November 2019. Racist graffiti, a swastika, a manifesto, all shaking the university campus. Many students leaving many students to leave early out of a fear campus wasn't safe.
That's right, Ricky. These hate crimes sparked the NotAgainSU protests and occupation in Crouse-Hines Hall. Protesters have alleged DPS officers treat white students with more respect and assume the worst when interacting with students of color.
Today's nearly 100-page report both looks into DPS's policies, how those policies were followed during the bias incidents and protests, and makes recommendations DPS for the future. Along the way, it offers a significant amount of new information about the university's handling of the bias incidents and protests. We're digesting this just as the rest of campus is. The report explains the important role DPS played on campus. It says DPS is often in the position of issuing the initial communications about high emotion events like bias-related incidents or possible threats of safety, though both DPS's public safety alerts and its subsequent updates. Now, we have a lot to cover in this report today from Loretta Lynch. In an email from Chancellor Syverud today, he tells the SU community that the actions taken by the university were exacerbated by fear.
He says that the university, quote, let you down. The administration says they believe it is clear where they fell short in the protests last year.
Syverud says the review is just the beginning in building community at SU. There will be forthcoming recommendations from the Board of Trustees Special Committee by mid-March.
These will be the first few steps in creating a university-wide strategic plan for diversity, inclusion, and equity access.
Students on campus are still reading through the report just like we are, and some are ready to share their thoughts. CitrusTV News reporter Louise Rath spoke with Student Association Vice President Ryan Golden to get the student perspective. Take a look.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm here in the Shine Student Center with Vice President of Student Association Ryan Golden. And Ryan, thank you for your time.
Anytime.
So how much of this DPS report have you been able to read into so far, and what's your initial reaction to it?
Well, between classes and other meetings I had, I was able to digest some of the recommendations. And I guess my overall reaction is that, there's a lot left to be desired. There are things that both Justine and I wanted to see in the recommendations, but aren't there. But I do want to, say that doesn't mean that they can't be a part of our moving forward plans. It doesn't mean that the Student Association can't push for the proposals that Justine and I were hoping to see in the report. And I guess that an overall idea, an overall opinion of the report is that it's an okay first step, and we're hoping to see the university takes that and does a whole lot more than just use the report.
Good. Do you feel as though this report validated any feelings or beliefs you hold towards the Department of Public Safety? I
think that the report did somewhat of a good job of looking at every concern students had, which is great. I guess my only problem is what the recommendation to help with that concern is. But it does validate how I feel about the Department of Public Safety. There are concerns about standards, practices, and conduct that are, while referenced in the recommendations, they don't really rise to the level that I would have liked to have seen. But they do validate my own opinions.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the recommendations you would have liked to see out of this report?
I would have liked to have seen, stricter language concerning conduct, concerning standards and practices when it relates to how they deal with students, their reaction to certain campus events. While they did mention speech events in the recommendations and not using, fully armed officers at them. That's great. There are some times where, it's not okay for officers especially officers who are armed, to react in inappropriate ways, and that needs to be able to be dealt with swiftly and not swept under the rug.
Okay. And per the email sent out by Chancellor Kent Syverud, he noted and alluded to them implementing the recommendations. Is there a certain timeline you feel is appropriate for them to implement these changes?
Well, I'd like to see them, implemented as fast as possible. I also don't want them to be done in a way that isn't productive. What I want is for the Student Association to be a part of any conversations about the Students of Color Advisory Committee that they recommended reconstituting, the Citizen Review Board that they recommended creating, because I'm all for creating boards, I'm all for creating committees. I don't want them to be toothless. They're asking for students to be a part of these committees, and I don't want students to be trying to do good work in the university, giving them no power to achieve their goals. What I would like to see is that, while yes, I'd like to see them done as fast as possible, I'd like for them to have been done yesterday. But I think that my more important priority is making sure that they're done well and with good consideration. So I think that from my point of view, I'd like to see the committees they're recommending have some teeth to them and have some ability to enforce the recommendations that they make.
Okay, good. And how confident are you in DPS's internal review system should something like this need to happen again? Say they need another investigation in the future. Are you confident they can do this on their own and not have to contact, an outside investigative system?
No, they need to always have a third party investigating them. And I think that goes for anything, not just a law enforcement agency. You will never be able to investigate your conduct and things you do effectively. As good intentioned as you may be, as anyone is, if SA ever had an issue of widespread, conduct issues, I wouldn't want anyone in SA to be conducting that review. I would ask for someone else to do it. Because what you want is for people who are more concerned with how an organization should act, and in this case, a Department of Public Safety should act, and that being their only frame of reference looking at your conduct, not someone who has maybe rationalized the things that you've done and accepted them.
Okay. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for your time. Reporting for Citrus TV News, I'm Louise Rath. Carmella and Ricky, back to you.
Thanks, Louise, and thank you, Ryan, for speaking with us. Now, we do have this entire report in front of us now, and we're going to do our best to break down what's in this report. Again, we're just going to tell you what we know for sure. Obviously, a lot of questions remain, as this is nearly 100 pages long. Something that sticks out to me first is on page 16, they talk about the standard operating procedures that the Department of Public Safety follows. It says that they reviewed the documentation of those events to determine if DPS adhered to those guidelines. It says that in most of these investigations, they determined that there were, at least in some respects, according to the documentation, places where DPS did not fully comply with that. It says that sometimes officers did not report having canvassed the area or having identified additional witnesses, as the standard operating procedures requires. Again, this is for those investigations that they were doing into bias incidents here on campus.
And another point where, in contrast to that, where DPS did follow procedure was in one of the contested videos we saw where a DPS officer was reaching for his holster it seemed to be where he was reaching for his gun. Now, in the document on page 35, it says, during the struggle, Deputy Chief Stardino was wearing over the garment that he was wearing over his concealed firearm. He told us that he felt his holster shifting backward on his hip, concerned it would come off his belt, and so while he resisted the urge to grab his weapon multiple times to adjust it, he felt eventually the need to readjust his weapon. So that's what happened during that situation, and that was a video that we saw quite frequently where students used as reference.
Mm-hmm. Another major incident was the incident that started so much of this, the incident in Day Hall where graffiti was found in the bathroom there. Something that students were very upset about was that the students were told by administrators not to record that meeting, and many students took that as the university trying to shut that down. And according to this, the administrator told the investigators that this was a standard statement for such community meetings to convey that the meeting was to be safe space for students to speak.
And another point we'd like to bring up is on page 44, where students were concerned, or are concerned, and still have concerns that DPS officers continually break up student parties held by students of color, whereas that's less frequently happening through parties held by white students. Now, this report states that that is primarily because many parties held by Greek life are held off campus, and those off-campus places aren't under the jurisdiction of DPS, whereas in the report it says many students of color hold parties on South Campus, which is under the jurisdiction of DPS. Now it says, during the past semester, the analysis concluded that of the 6 parties held last semester that were shut down, 3 were majority white, 2 were majority people of color, and 1 was mixed. Now, of course, the document does state this data was only for the data of last semester.
Yeah, and we're now joined by Citrus TV analyst Rob Flaks. Rob, where does the report detail how the DPS response was not what students had wanted from DPS?
Well, guys, you mentioned that for that delay in the reporting of that meeting that happened on Day Hall, that delay caused a lack of faith in the administration, and students no longer thought the administration was forthcoming with information and acting in good faith. And when it comes to DPS, the report details that some officers didn't view the hate crimes, the racist language, as a hate crime. They saw it just as vandalism. The report goes on to say one police officer who had to have it explained to them how harmful psychologically it might be to see a racial slur that's directed at you. The report says that this cop was not an outlier, and this was indeed a systemic issue. And the systemic issues that students did experience, they say DPS minimized events when they reported to them, pushing back, often acting in defense of those people who might have done some of the defenses, and that's why they felt a little uncomfortable coming through that. Another failure was DPS was unable to locate the poster of the manifesto. Now, they found the IP address, but they had used the VPN, and so they weren't actually able to find them. But another crucial finding was the fear that students felt. The report says that that fear was a failure of DPS to accurately communicate, quote, a misapprehension by DPS of the fear felt by students and a failure to allay those fears with effective communications, basically saying if DPS was more forthcoming and had better information, then fear and rumor would not have taken hold. And that fear and rumor was what created a campus atmosphere where many students felt they had to leave.
Now, Rob, students at the Not Again SU protests were scared, according to the report. So how much of that report says it was due to the way that they were communicated to by DPS?
Well, again, administration just waited too long in terms of sending information and really tarnished relations. At that point, students say that they thought the initial statement from the chancellor was defensive, and that went down and trickled into DPS. But again, the report also states that DPS was in a tough situation. SU administration was changing guidance, changing guidelines, and students really weren't interacting with them. They were interacting with DPS, and so DPS was put in that uncomfortable position. But again, guys, going back to that manifesto that was posted on Greek Rank, it was not airdropped. That was a myth. But again, DPS took too long to dispel that rumor, and the report officially stated how kids now grow up with mass shooting drills. They're acutely aware of it, and the nature of an airdrop is that someone is around you. They're nearby. They were afraid that that person nearby meant to do harm to them, and DPS did not act to dispel that notion quickly enough.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that looking through this report here on the topic of that manifesto itself, it says that the information that was given to DPS was secondhand. They did not actually speak with any students who received the manifesto itself, and it's clear from looking through here that that manifesto was from Greek Rank, which we know about, and there was no actual airdrop, as you mentioned. And earlier today, a student journalist on campus sat down virtually with Loretta Lynch. They and the university have shared that sound with us, so we can bring it to you. Lynch spoke about the recommendations they made.
We have come up with 23 specific recommendations for the Department of Public Service that we feel will improve both their investigations and their community policing and community engagement, and 10 specific recommended changes to current standard operating procedures and policies that we think will also help them and begin to regain trust with them.
Now, one of the big questions, of course, is what happens next? The Not Again SU protesters say recently the university wasn't following through with their actual demands. Lynch indicated her recommendations may see a different outcome.
I'm tremendously gratified. My understanding is that the university is planning to adopt our recommendations. At least the Department of Public Safety has indicated they are planning to adopt our recommendations. Obviously, the chancellor will have to speak on that, but I believe that.
Now, they did not do this report alone. Lynch explained how they worked with other organizations.
We were working with a law enforcement expert, a former police chief from California who worked with me at the Department of Justice, who was the head of the community-oriented policing service at the Department of Justice when I was the Attorney General, and also was the executive director of President Obama's task force on 20.
Now, of course, it takes more than just writing a report to solve any of the issues happening on campus. Lynch says that for the report to be helpful, DPS should accept the recommendations that she provides.
We can make all the great recommendations that we want. If they're not put into practice and policy, this report will just be paper, and that doesn't help anybody. So for this report to be helpful, The Department of Public Safety, in my view, needs to adopt our recommendations, and the university, I believe, will support that. But I will also say that the university community needs to stay involved and stay active in this issue. This is not a one-way street. No, the Department of Public Safety has to hear from the community. They have to have those hard conversations. That's one of the reasons we recommend reviving the Students of Color Advisory Committee.
Lynch finishes her remarks by saying that she hopes this report will help make all communities on campus safer.
And so for people to feel really safe and secure, they have to feel that they have a hand in crafting that environment. And so it's our hope that our report can be useful, and that with Chief Davis working with the Department of Public Safety and the university going forward, that they'll take steps to implement these changes. No matter how small they are, no matter what their issue is, because that group has an issue today, another group would have a different issue tomorrow. And everyone needs to feel that they're going to be heard, and that they're going to have their needs and their concerns taken into account. And that if in fact it highlights real issues, as it did here, that there will be a response that will work to improve those issues.
And in the time we have left, we do want to go over a little bit more of this report. It is a long one. Something that caught my eye here was here on page 31. It regards the restrictions of food that were on the protesters when they were in Krause Heinz Hall. It said the administration decided to restrict outside food, and the policy remained in place for approximately the first 48 hours of the protest. Now, previously, we knew that for sure that was taking place for 15 hours. But it's also worth mentioning here that there was food, that they had food, that the administrators told the investigators here that the protesters did already have food in here. And of course, there was a lot of back and forth back then on whether or not there was actually being food restricted.
Now, really quick before we go, I just want to bring it back to some of the resolutions that Lynch described in the document. She says, she states that the DPS should not operate the campus safety escort service. This is where a primary amount of the complaints against DPS officers have occurred. She says DPS should also determine where armed officers are necessary and unnecessary. The report didn't say that DPS should remove armed officers. They should just specify which specific situations they're necessary in. And situations like students being locked out of dorms and other routine dormitory procedures shouldn't include armed DPS officers. And finally, the council states that it should be every officer's responsibility to build trusting relationships with the campus community. Once the pandemic ends, DPS should resume previously existing programs aimed at community engagement, as well as the Student of Color Advisory Committee.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have a lot more on this throughout the week, as well as on CitrusTV.com.
And that's all the time we have for today's special report. Be sure to check out our continuing coverage, as Ricky mentioned, on CitrusTV News and CitrusTV.com.
And that's all from us here at Citrus TV. I'm Ricky Sayer.
And I'm Carmella Boykin. Have a great night, Syracuse.